So here's the question. How do we prepare for ethical issues of discoveries not yet made? How would we have prepared for CRISPR?
How would we have prepared for CRISPR? Yeah, that's a good question because, like, I sort of, I don't know what you think, but I sort of feel like, I mean, CRISPR sort of exploded and everyone's saying, like, what do we do? And yet I feel like, you know, historically, like, we've dealt with the same things over and over again.
Right, so first learn history.
Yeah, learn history. Yeah, right. Read Dan's books. I mean, like, really, because it's like, I mean, in a way, there's a lot, I don't know what you think, but I feel like there's a lot of deja vu here. You know, people are like, oh my gosh, like all these things are happening and this is really scary, but we've sort of been through this before. And, you know, maybe that's comforting or maybe that should be disturbing, you know, but we can at least look at the times we've dealt with these things before, recombinant DNA, for example, you know. I mean, I don't know if you think that there are particular lessons that people can take to, like, think about the ethical issues with CRISPR now. I mean.
Well, I mean, the new ethical issues raised by CRISPR, it seems to me, or let me put it this way, that old ethical issues have been made more concrete by CRISPR. Because people,
so it was hypothetical before, and now it's really going to happen.
Very hypothetical before in the case of recombinant DNA. And now, I mean, we have a kind of confluence of technologies here. The recombinant DNA has become CRISPR technology. Selective breeding among human beings, the Nazis tried to do it, has become in vitro fertilization, right? Mm-hmm. So we have a combination, a confluence of technologies that make the concrete realization of these prospects much more probable and reachable. So then that makes not the ethical issues new, though they have to be connected to the technologies that would enable them, which is then to say that however we choose to regulate this technology must be tied to how we can use it. All right. So it goes back to the nuclear model that I suggested earlier, that so you would want to be looking at in vitro fertilization, you would want to be looking at what kind of actual changes were made in the genome, et cetera. You'd want to look at safety, you'd want to look at efficacy and so on. But, you know, there's another element here that we haven't discussed, except only tangentially, and that is, and the tangential part is the biotech industry and the very powerful economic incentives that it introduces into the use of this technology. The part that we haven't talked about directly, we could profitably spend a few minutes on, is the medical industry. Because none of these, no form of CRISPR technology is going to be realized, used, made available, except it seems to me in a medical context. I can't imagine that we're going to have independent walk-in CRISPR clinics, you know, on 8th Street or here on Broadway, where people can just go in and have their fetus's genes enhanced. This is going to be a medical procedure that'll have to be carried out in a medical context. And that then tells us that we need to think about the equity in the access to medical care, right? All of these technologies having to do with genetic diagnosis, genetic therapy, and now CRISPR enhancement can, it seems to me, not be separated from the ethical issues of how we organize and manage the availability of medical care.
I don't think we have that much control, and I'm thinking about stem cells. So right now, there are all these like stem cell clinics all over the place that are just on the fringes of the medical world. They're not really regulated. They're here in the United States, they're in China, they're in other places.
Right.
They're making all sorts of promises. People are going there and spending tens of thousands of dollars for stem cell treatments.
I think
you will have walk-in clinics for CRISPR. I think you will. I mean, IVF clinics right now, like they're kind of controlled.
That's true. But you know,
they'll add on a CRISPR option.
Right. But
while you're here
in this country, yeah. Well, maybe you're right. Heaven help us. But here's a reason why IVF clinics and stem cell clinics operate the way they do outside of the regulatory regime of government, and that is because under federal law, you no federal money can be spent on anything having to do with the manipulation of embryos. Okay, so stem cells is like that. Falls under that category. IVF definitely falls under that category. And as a result, the only regulatory laws we have are state laws, where stem cells and IVF, et cetera, are brought under state regulation. But because of the anti-abortion movement and the right to life movement, going back to the 1970s was something called the Hyde Amendment after Congressman Hyde of Illinois, who was a very profound social conservative. No federal money can be spent for any of these purposes. And without that kind of expenditure, the reach of the federal government, then the federal government cannot reach into these private clinics. So that the only place that we have had recombinant DNA regulation, for example, is under research done with money from the National Institutes of Health. All right. So since the National Institutes of Health are proscribed from supporting this kind of work, they are also they cannot reach to anything that's outside.
Interesting.
So what we have to do is to change the scope of admissible federal regulation, it seems to me.
I think it's my turn.
Yep.
Okay. All right. What would it take for people to understand a scientific issue, to understand the scientific issues well enough for democracy to craft good policy?